G'day and welcome to the Build Me a Brewery podcast. My name is Chris Hayton and this is our final guest featured episode of Season 1. Just before I go into doing an introduction to today's episode, I wanted to briefly mention to all listeners that I've created a short episode after this which nicely sums up the original series of the podcast, as well as my biggest learnings to date, where I'm at in my brewery building plans, and I also share with you all the future direction of the podcast. So make sure you have a listen to the Season 1 conclusion episode. Another reminder for our upcoming Inner West Brewery Crawl event on Friday the 30th of April. For those local to Sydney or willing to make the journey in, we'll be visiting 4 breweries, some that have featured on the podcast so far, where we'll be getting a behind-the-scenes look at the breweries, Q&A sessions with owners and head brewers, and you'll also get the chance to network and chat with like-minded people over some great beer. I've left a link in the show notes to the Facebook event with all the details, so need to confirm final numbers very soon. Moving on to today's episode then, I chat with General Manager of the Independent Brewers Association, Kylie Lethbridge, to discuss their role in the independent craft beer industry and the benefits of a brewery becoming a member of the IBA Association. With a focus on supporting independent craft breweries, the IBA sets out to provide an industry representation and advocacy across all levels of government to make it easier to open up and operate an independent brewery here in Australia. The IBA, in my opinion, does such a great job in providing unity and a loud voice for smaller breweries wishing to have a good crack at producing and selling great beer, and representing them for better conditions for operators within the industry. As many of you will know and have learnt during this podcast series, that breweries are up against an extremely regulated and taxed industry. So the IBA is there to help fight for better conditions and regulations for new entrants and established ones. Having over 500 members made up of breweries and associates, Kylie explains for listeners today the IBA's role in the industry for independent breweries and its members, what their past and present lobbying efforts have been on the hot topic issues and challenges facing the industry, and shares her outlook on the years to come for brewery operators here in Oz. So I hope you all enjoy my chat then with General Manager of the IBA, Kylie Lethbridge. Welcome, Kylie Lethbridge, to the Build Me a Brewery podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Nice to meet you, Chris, and I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, it's good to, like you were saying earlier, to put a face to the name, even if it is via Zoom. But I really do appreciate yourself and also the Independent Brewers Association, the IBA, wanting to get involved in the podcast. And it's essentially going to form part of it's the last episode of the season, or the original series that I sort of had planned to set out for the Build Me a Brewery podcast. And I thought it would be a nice way to finish it all off by giving our listeners an understanding of what support small breweries or small craft breweries have within the industry. And essentially that is exactly what the IBA sets out to do, providing representation for independent breweries. So I'd really like to provide some good content for the listeners on exactly who the IBA is, its purpose, benefits for its members, and also diving into some of the recent lobbying efforts and challenges facing the industry. So, but before we get into all that, I'd like to get to know a bit more about yourself, Kylie, get an understanding of how you came to become the general manager of the IBA, your career background before it, and if you've got any stories or a point in your life when you sort of came towards leaning into the craft beer industry. Take it away.
I won't kind of go into too much detail about the career history because we want to get to the information that's relevant to the people that are listening, Chris. But fundamentally, my background is predominantly in tourism, destination development, and destination marketing primarily. I started out my career working for ministerial offices. Quickly realised that that wasn't for me, and that I was more happy to work on the outside in a political environment. And so have fundamentally worked in tourism destination development around the world. I've worked interstate and overseas in that space, and similarly to the industry I now work in, it's working with a group of small businesses to try and help them, raise awareness, work on their product, very, very similar to what I'm doing now. So there was a good basis there for that evolution. most directly before I came here, I had worked in two different councils. So I worked for local government in the economic development space, trying to help businesses establish themselves, help them grow, get them through the council process, permits, regulations. And I know we're going to talk a bit about that, so I'll kind of go into more detail later. And I did a lot of work in the trade space there, so developed trade relationships with Japan, the Middle East, and again, all about supporting small business in some way, shape and form. And that went from everything from the regulatory environment to marketing to development. I built industrial estates myself, not physically with my hands, but got government grants to do that, to create jobs in regional areas. So a fairly diverse career until I got to the point that I decided I didn't want to work for government anymore. Local politicians can be very challenging when you're trying to achieve something. And I wanted to work at the coalface, for want of a better term, for an industry that I was really passionate about, and took some time to work through, executive recruitment agencies and got good advice as to where I should go. And the first opportunity I had, or the first thought I had about looking for a job, this came up, and it had been re-advertised. So the IBA had a go at trying to find somebody earlier, which was just prior to Christmas in 2019. And, when sometimes, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, Chris, where you see a job and think, that is my dream job, that is mine. Yeah. I will have that job. And so I applied with, a huge amount of excitement. And I think the enthusiasm that I had probably came through in my application, because the board, they said to me, well, you're a very left of field candidate, but, we really want to meet you. And so I then jumped on a plane and had some time in Spain while Corona, COVID was going crazy, came home and had a couple of interviews, one and two interview, and got along really well with everybody, and thankfully got the job. To answer your other question, the passion comes from a lifelong experience, and I guess love of drinking beer. I have always been a beer drinker. I've always liked to try new experiences. That comes with, working in the food and wine industry as well, which I had done for a little period of time. And so the desire to work in this industry came also from the fact that for a few years back in sort of 2007, 2008, I part-owned a pub with my family. So I worked full-time, but I also worked on the business and in the business. I feel extremely comfortable behind a bar pulling beers. So it was another kind of, in the list of positives and negatives of where you want to be. It was definitely, this is what I want to do, but in a different way. And I wanted to use those skills that I had developed over the years to benefit the organisation that I worked for. So lots of things have come round to, I guess, me being where I am today.
Yeah, so it's always good to hear the female side when it comes to beer, because, there's always been this stigma attached to, only men like beer. And I love it when I talk to someone and see a female drinking a beer. It's just like, that's how I sort of fell in love with my wife, actually. I said, well, you get along with my mates and you drink beer, you know what I mean? And so, yeah,
she must be the one.
Yeah, exactly. So, but talking a bit about, I guess, your love of beer, a few fun facts about yourself I'd like to know. What is your go-to style of beer?
Oh, that's so hard. I had this question the other day. I was out drinking some beers with a friend of mine, and somebody that I didn't know particularly well said, what's your favourite style of beer? And I said, it's really, really hard. A good IPA for me is a bonus, though I do really, in certain times I like a good stout. I have to admit to you openly that I'm only just getting my head around, on my taste buds is probably a better term, around a sour.
Yep.
Since I've come to work for the beer industry, I think I might be more a traditionalist when it comes to the styles that I like, but I absolutely will give anything a go. And I have taken this opportunity, particularly around the Indies when, I really wanted to, our awards, I really wanted to try and experience those that I hadn't tasted before, particularly those that were winning medals in our awards and others. And so, I always kind of came from the perspective that I really liked German style beers, but then I lived in the UK, I lived in Scotland for a while. So, that formulates your taste buds. So I reckon a bit of everything. But no, I do like a good wheat beer, and I do like a good IPA.
It's amazing how many people have come on and said, that IPA is their go-to. Some have said as well, like you said, we've talked about sours. I never thought I'd like sours. I'm not crazy about them, and there's only a couple that I do really enjoy, but yeah, I'm more of a savoury person, to be honest. So sour doesn't.
I think they're really good, Chris, for people that aren't beer fans, aren't diehard beer fans. So I think what I see is a good, and I was having this conversation with one of our associate members in Austin, Texas, a couple of weeks back, and he said he was never really a beer drinker, but he was working with the Brewers Association in Australia, and they gave him a set of sours, and it kind of got him hooked a little bit into, right, okay, this is a different way. And I think, again, some of the, journos that I work with or food media, the sours are a good way to attract a broader audience that weren't traditionally beer drinkers.
Yeah, absolutely. And even like seltzers as well seems to be a little gateway for people but
increase in seltzer.
Yeah. I wasn't quite sure going into this interview. I know that you're the representation in the industry and will involve with government bodies and so forth. But it's really, I guess you've got to have a love for beer to be doing what you're doing. So I guess you can find some people who are very good at administrators and managers, but the love of craft beer will, that I guess sets you apart in that regards. But I'd like to, I guess, for the audience, just to open up part of our content, learning a bit more about the IBA. Independent breweries or an independent brewery, it's been debated a little bit. The definition has changed a little bit over the recent years as to what exactly is a member of the IBA and who's eligible. But because I know there was a decision in 2017 to move away from the Craft Brewers Association name to the Independent Brewers Association. So can you explain for the audience, I guess, the definition the IBA has for independent brewers?
So, yeah, I think, and obviously I wasn't around at that time, but the move from, I think the Craft Brewers Association had a different focus and had a different range of activities, small volunteer committee. And again, the industry was different at that stage. So the growth of, and you look at any industry sector, the growth of a representative body needs to move alongside the growth of an industry. And certainly since 2016, if you look at the statistics and the growth of craft, whatever you want to call it, small independent breweries, the exponential growth since about that time is forced the industry to change in terms of its representative body that was working on marketing and a little bit of advocacy here and there with a small volunteer group, and kind of one paid staff member that my understanding was wasn't full time. So again, it was the industry's growing, which means they need a representative body that is sophisticated in understanding the needs of a growing industry, that is resourced to be able to adapt and deliver on what a growing industry needs. And, prior to COVID, we had a new brewery coming on every 6 days nationally. So, again, your industry association needs to grow and evolve in conjunction with that growth. So the recognition, I think, back, as you mentioned, in 2017 was the larger breweries and the more commercial breweries were realising the opportunity that came with a brand that said craft, and therefore started to create their own to be able to compete, as any good business would. And so the industry and the board and the leadership group of at the time wanted to provide a clear delineation between what was independent and what had the word craft written on its packaging or product, and therefore the name of the organisation and the programs and projects, which we'll talk a little bit more about in terms of the independent seal, came from that as a recognition of saying, this is that, And we're not that. We're small, we're Australian owned. You know, our taxes, we employ locals, we contribute to our community, and, you know, we're part of a national organisation. We're artisan in nature in that our products are very easily adaptable. We're looking at what we put in our ingredients. They're not mass produced. We change them regularly. We work, you know, we're the local bar, so we work very much in conjunction with, as I said, our communities on the ground. And they also looked at the time and a lot more since about what was going on in other countries and how they had established the recognition of independent versus large-scale commercial. And a good way to do that was the name of the organisation. It was also the release of and creation of things like the Independent Seal and a constitution that basically said, here's the people that we want to support, and this is how we're going to do it. And so at the time, they decided to create what they believed was an organisation that would be able to evolve over time. They set some targets, they set some KPIs around what they wanted to achieve, and are well on their way to achieving those.
I recall listening to an episode that, is it Jamie Cook from Stone and Wood?
He was the previous chairman before the current chair. Yeah.
Yeah. I think Lachlan McLean from Beer Cartel had him on a couple of years ago, and just sort of getting some more background on the IBA, my research. Yeah, he was talking a lot about all the different advocacy groups that are sort of established and what sort of targets and sort of lobbying efforts that are going on, which we'll dive into a bit more later in our interview. But one question I did have, because there's other associations in different countries that are very similar, like the American Brewers Association. I know in the UK there's one. Do they have similar definitions and eligibility in terms of like who, because American Brewers Association, that can include any brewery, where the IBA essentially, they have strict criteria or criteria around who can become a member, of volume, putting out, ownership of the company. That's essentially what it is, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, my understanding from the time was they took a little bit of everything and created what they felt was appropriate for our country and the growth of our sector, and where they felt they wanted to focus their efforts in a way that didn't alienate, but embraced as many of the industries they could. And so you're right, the joining process, that to be eligible to be a member, you have to prove a certain amount of things in terms of ownership, and our membership structure is based on tiers, and to work out which tier you're in, you need to give us your information on how many litres you produce per year, and that usually comes from excise tax paperwork. So again, at the time, my understanding is they took a little bit of what was happening in New Zealand. They took a little bit about, again, you're right, there's organisations all over the world. There's one in Italy, which I've had a look at. The BA, we took Brewers Association in Australia. We took a little bit of what they did, but again, it's very, and why I say same but different is I think they've got about 5,000 members. We, at the last report, had about, let's say, 580 breweries that don't include contract brewers. And so, numbers-wise, we're nowhere near the size of our organisation, the sophistication, we're nowhere near where they have. They've got a head start of years. So again, at the time, the leadership group that did involve Jamie Cook, legend of the industry and a bloody great bloke, came up with what they thought was appropriate for our industry. And again, the commercial brewers in this country, there's only two of them. So it was easy to say, that's them, and this is what they look like, and this is us, and this is where we want to put our effort and our funding and our resources.
Right. Well, many of the listeners know who the IBA is, especially those working in the industry and the role it plays. But to put on the record, I guess, for the audience, can you explain for us simply how the IBA came to light and what role it plays? I know that you probably touched on a little bit of the history of it, what the role it plays in the brewing industry and so forth.
Sure. There's kind of two parts to this story. In a pre-COVID world, our role was slightly different. My role certainly, had we have not had the 2020 that we did, would have been slightly different. However, fundamentally, our job is to implement the organisation's strategic plan and to meet those targets that I talked to you about earlier in terms of market share. So our aim is to have 15% of market share by 2025, and to have a strong awareness of the independent seal and what that means in place. And so the activities that we programs, activities, the things that we do obviously are all about delivering on those targets. And our strategic plan, we do events. It's the primary focus of a big part of the team. Obviously, you would know about BrewCon, which is our major conference, and that's sadly was cancelled last year, but we're very super excited about this year's event. It's on the Sunshine Coast on the welcoming function on the 30th of August. So hopefully everybody is aware of that. The information is on our website now about BrewCon. And we've picked a fantastic venue on the Sunshine Coast. There's going to be lots of fun, lots of good VIP parties, lots of, the program is going to be fantastic in terms of subject matter. In conjunction with BrewCon, again, in a non-COVID year, we usually run our Indies Awards, which is, and I know there's a lot of awards, and one of the things that I'm trying to do is to work with, my aim is to work with those awards so we're not duplicating, we're actually adding benefit for people to join or to enter into awards. We had to have an online version last year. I don't know if you had a look at it on YouTube, but it was so much fun and it was absolutely fantastic. And it was a really good opportunity for the industry to celebrate after what had been a really tough time for everyone. Those awards are now being recognised. We're putting programs in place where we have longevity after the awards. So we're working with trade, Dan's, BWS, Coles to look at having winners packs in retail beyond, the night of the awards essentially, so people are getting really good value out of entering. We're revising and reviewing constantly our judging programs, so we not only have a variety of experience in this space, but we also are mentoring new judges through the industry, which is a part of our role. We have industry events, we call them mashups in each state, where we get together with local brewers, we put on a pizza or some beers and some beers. We either hear from a speaker or we hear from them, or we've got a mashup coming up at the end of March in conjunction with the Hop Harvest Festival in the High Country in Victoria. We're looking at scheduling one in New South Wales. Now we can do that again. So we run those around the country with our members, and non-members are welcome as well. We run consumer events. Our largest is Good Beer Week, which is traditionally a Melbourne-based event that is, again, sadly was cancelled last year, but it is its 10th year and will run from the 14th of May to the 23rd of May this year. Good Beer Week is a celebration of beer generally and the venues really that support our industry. So it's a highlight on Hospo this year to help, help them after a really tough year, particularly in Victoria. And our intention is to evolve Good Beer Week as a national event. In 2018, the IBA absorbed or merged with Good Beer Week. It was a separate organisation, so it's now part of the IBA, and therefore we'll evolve that to deliver on that strategic plan that I talked about earlier in terms of awareness of what independent beer is and the venues that support them. We have Indie Beer Day, and we also have Indie Beer Showcase, which is consumer direct events, which again we hadn't traditionally done, before a couple of years ago, but that's where we're heading as a way to get seal out and about and to have consumers be able to come and experience, be in person, talk to the brewers, and just have a good time, listen to some music and a few other bits and pieces. So events is definitely a big part of what we do, but so is advocacy. The industry, either from a state perspective or a federal perspective, could do with a lot more help in this space. We pay the third highest tax on beer in the world, and we sometimes pay multiple times depending on how that is packaged. And so one of our most significant, or the focus of our advocacy efforts, is on that excise rebate, the taxes that we pay in the regulatory environment that doesn't actually help us, it stifles the growth. So we've just done an economic impact analysis of the industry that we're looking to launch at Parliament House in Canberra this coming Monday, where we say, here's the data on what our opportunities are. Here's where we were, 4 or 5 years ago. This is the growth. This is the positive tax revenue. This is the wages you can collect. If you only help us now to grow, then look where you could be in 10 years' time. And the comparison we make there is with Wine Australia. They were given a significant and still are amount of federal support to create a body called Wine Australia years ago, many, many years ago, decades ago. And it was, and still is one of the reasons that they enjoy the success that they are today. Yet I would argue should be our national drink. We're Australians, we drink beer. Yet that's not recognised anywhere. And so one of our key efforts in this space, and what I do most of my days, is talking to federal MPs and particularly ministers about and developing submissions for the federal budget and other opportunities that come along to have us recognised. We're not sitting as an important industry in any federal manufacturing strategy, no federal ag strategy or small business strategy. So again, my work has been getting on that radar, and having this new data that I just mentioned is an absolute monster in having them recognise that we're actually an opportunity. So advocacy is a big part, but I also do lots of advocacy at a local level. We just responded to a review of Western Australia licensing regs. We do, container deposit scheme. I imagine you've kind of had to deal with as a result of this series. It's a big, confusing beast that, to be really frank, took me ages to get my head around. And as a brewer, it just must be mind-numbing with the different states and the, how charges per package and how that works. So we've been heavily involved in advocating against the proposed scheme that they're looking to put into Victoria, and one that they now are looking to replicate in Tasmania. So we participate there, and on as much as we can, really. There's state strategies to support the beer industry in Queensland and New South Wales, and there have been really fantastic vehicles to get support and funding and recognition for the industry. So I'm working with every other state to try and have dedicated plans in place similar to those in Queensland and New South Wales that would enable the industry to grow, again, locally, because as you would know, the regulation and the environment in states is different to federal. So not only do you have to tackle one layer, you obviously have to tackle three when it comes to local government as well. So, but the other big part of what we deliver, Chris, is resources for our members. And so, just as an example, this week I had to help, somebody understand where we're at with wages. Human resource management is a challenge. A small brewery or even a medium-sized brewery doesn't often have a HR service. So we look to be able to provide resources on things like labelling and packaging and quality assurance. And to do that, we provide either guidelines. We've just done a series of webinars, which we're doing more of, and they're certainly very popular. But again, we ask our members what the issues are that they need at the time and roll out resources to deal with that. Pregnancy labelling was a big thing and took up a lot of our time, the introduction of that. So now we're playing in the space of participating in the review of Food Standards Australia New Zealand, because what they're doing is a big challenge for the industry in the future and a big cost. But we also work in partnership with Food and Drinks Australia, Distillers Association, Cider Associations. We all have very similar interests in some instances. We work with the Brewers Association here even, because we have things that are similar, issues that we have that are common to CUB and Lion and Coopers, and then in other instances where, as far apart as we can be. So a range of tools that we provide our members, and the fantastic resource that we have under that is our project groups. So we have a sustainability project group. We're doing at the minute a benchmarking tool that will hopefully allow our members to save funds in the end when it comes to energy use. A range of programs that our project groups, and those are volunteer people that are dedicating their time to us and to help deliver the benefit for members that we hope they're getting from their fees.
You mentioned a little bit in the beginning about the independent seal and what that means. Are you able to tell the audience, I guess, the importance of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, you've had a look at what the BA are doing in the States. So our organisation looked at that at the time, and the board and a group of very passionate and dedicated what I would call industry leaders, people that have been around for a long time and set the benchmark for what we're doing, created the independent seal. The sad thing about it is that, there were massive plans to launch and go crazy getting that out to venues and direct to consumers. Then COVID hit. So we had to very, very quickly change what we were doing. And instead of a big launch, it became a support your local, you've got to get out and support your local independent brewer. So we're now just finalising guidelines for our members in terms of here's some ways in which you can use that seal. Our primary aim is to have a person buying that goes in and buys beer, either within, either a beer fan or those that are considering different types of beer or trying new beer experiences, that they actually recognise what that is and what it means. And so the rollout of that for us was first for our members to be displaying it on their packaging. So if you see a can with the seal on it, you know that means Australian owned, supporting your locals and all of the other things that come along with it. We then had worked very, very close with trade last year for them to display that independent seal. So we provided a huge amount of point of sale, shelf talkers, fridge stickers, wobblers, and it was really well taken up. So we were, I was super, super grateful to the trade last year who just said, yep, we'll take whatever you've got. They all took on extra supplies of craft or indie beer. They changed their payment terms. They were just really fantastic. And the result, the statistics illustrate that Aussie supported locals last year and craft beer sales went up at all of those retailers. So that was kind of the next level rollout, was that where you're at point of sale, so whether you're in a bar or whether you're in a bottle shop, or that you would see that seal and it would start to resonate with you over time as to what that meant. We're now rolling out illuminated signs for hanging outside of venues for those that, again, support our sector. And there's some that have supported craft or indie beer for a very long time. So we're working with those to have that seal displayed and roll out as much as possible. Then as we kind of get this year's planning for events out of the way, we're looking at direct-to-consumer marketing, which a proper marketing plan where we actually try and talk to people outside what we call the beer bubble and have, foodies and those people that, again, are willing to or looking for new experiences to understand where they can go and get a tasting pad or where they can do a new tour. Brewery tours are going through the roof, whether that be tour operators doing them or groups of breweries working together. So we're trying to build more content on our website, the consumer-facing tools that we own and run. So, you know where your local brewery tour is, or you go to the Sunshine Coast and to give Josh a ring because his brewery tour is fantastic. Or, you're looking for the Inner West breweries in Sydney are doing some amazing work together through a government grant they got to develop a plan about, street signage and stuff like that. So there's some really good experiences that we can promote, and that's the next step for us in terms of the seal, which we haven't traditionally done either as the CIBA or the IBA has gone direct to consumer. We've been a very industry-facing event, but listening to our members last year, the evolution that they want us to take is to go direct to consumer to align with their own individual marketing activities. So that's exactly what we're going to do.
Yeah, perfect. Well, already it sounds like you guys have got your plate full with all these initiatives, and I guess I'd like to dive into more about some of the advocacy groups that we were talking about earlier, and probably just more the biggest topics and challenges that the IBA is facing. It's come up quite a few times on the podcast so far about excise reform. I'd like to talk to you more about some of the planning laws as well, which had Ben Tesario from CPS and also Russell Steele from Liquor Professionals talking about some of the, changes around how people can go through council and the CDC route. But yeah, I guess just to start this part of the segment, you mentioned there earlier excise. What are some of the recent lobbying efforts and milestones that the IBA's had in regards to improving some of the excise conditions for smaller independent breweries?
Sure. Again, prior to my time, the IBA was successful in, I think I've seen photos of ScoMo even announcing a change in the excise rebates. So, the comparison that I made earlier to the wine industry is the wet tax, that's the wine excise tax that's in place, provides up to $350,000 in rebates for wineries, small wineries. And so fundamentally we're saying we just want that. We don't want any more we don't want favoritism. We don't want any more than what you're giving anyone else. We just want an equal playing field, which is words that I use quite regularly. And as I said to you before, the emphasis and the resources that come from being recognised at that space, we just want to enjoy those same benefits. And so as the first step to that, Scott Morrison announced, it was 2018, that the excise rebate that was in place for breweries was only $30,000. You compare that to $350,000, and obviously that's significant for any business. It means you can employ more people, do more things. And so he announced that the rebate was going from $30,000 to $100,000. So, a win. That was a win, an absolute win for the industry, and a bonus for anybody that has to pay excise tax, which is the vast majority. And so what we're asking for, and what, I would love $1 for every time I've mentioned it in the last 12 months, is that $350,000. So we realise that we're punching quite high in order to have it increase from 100 to 350. But again, I talked to you earlier about the fact that we've done that modelling that looks at saying, well, if you give us this rebate now, this means this amount of positive tax revenue in the future. This means we can create this many jobs and have, broader benefit delivered to our national manufacturing strategy. And so I jump in wherever I can. The federal government had consultation period open earlier, but possibly, it was late last year, on the fact that, they had a federal manufacturing modernisation grant, which 3 indie breweries were successful in receiving funding from last year. They've just run another round of it, but now they're putting a strategy in place. So we responded to that, a very detailed response that says this is where we feel we can fit in this priority, this priority, and this priority. And they've just started releasing what they're calling their roadmaps. And so one is the food and beverage roadmap, which is scheduled to be launched at the end of March. So that will test really whether they've taken us seriously, whether or not our efforts have been rewarded in providing these submissions and trying to meet with every member of government. I couldn't tell you how many meetings that I've had with people just to try and raise awareness of who we are and what we're doing. The benefit of that is if you're in strategy, if you're in policy, whether it be local, state or federal, resources come, funding comes, and you have more of a voice. So that's a big part of what we're doing with excise. I mentioned to you earlier that we're launching that study at Parliament House on Monday. So the board, myself and the board are travelling to Canberra. We've got a series of meetings with ministers on the Monday, and then we've got a Parliament, they're called a Friends of Parliamentary event, where we're going to serve some beer and we're going to have some food, and we're going to have a talk to them about what our requests are that came from our pre-budget submission. So those were, they're preparing the federal budget now, so we got that in January, which basically is, we want you to change excise and we want you to develop a national strategy for our industry and resource that similar to Wine Australia. Obviously, the proposals are much more detailed and they're shared with members. So if you've got members listening, they're on our website and on the portal. They can access those advocacy documents to try and understand what we're doing at that space. So hopefully, we'd love to hear a result from the federal government that there's some movement there. We'd like to see us mentioned in the food and beverage. We'd like to see the word craft, we're okay with that, or independent beer mentioned in the national manufacturing strategy for food and beverages. So that's a big part of what we're doing in regard to advocacy. The planning component, as I said to you earlier, my experience in local government has actually, I didn't think that I would need to use it in this job, to be very frank, but I have. I quite often am involved in helping breweries get through a planning process because it is complex, and the planning system, no matter what state you're in, doesn't keep up with modern trends. And so their definition of hospitality, or their definition of a pub or a community's perception of what that is, often, taints the process that a brewery can have through that process. And again, I mentioned to you earlier that it doesn't mean because you can brew a fantastic beer, it doesn't mean you're a marketer, it doesn't mean you're a town planner. So often these processes are just mind-numbing and therefore, in the end, extremely costly. So I write letters of support regularly. I've even, spoken to planning committees in support of the brewer to try and dispel the myth, because they'll get objections from the community or the town planner won't understand it, to try and dispel the myth of we're not a pub that's going to spew out people onto the street that are, blind drunk. This is not the experience you have at an independent brew tap house or what have you. So I also help quite a few brewers get grants for their build and their development, because lots of states have grants to create new jobs. So I've worked with many brewers to get through the grant process and how to write grants, because again, I have a background in doing that. The other thing that we do, as I said to you earlier, is we tackle the planning issue through the state conversations. So if we've got a real issue in a state, we work at this level as well as on the ground level. And, as an example, New South Wales and Queensland in their craft brewing or independent brewing action plans both have requirements to deal with some of the planning regs, because they realise it's not helping the industry grow. It's actually stifling them in some instances. And the work from the government's perspective is fantastic, and we're looking at that next project in Queensland at the minute is addressing what the planning issues are. However, I always say that changing a planning scheme is like trying to turn the Titanic. It doesn't happen quickly, but the fact that it's happening, the fact that we're aware of it, and we know that when we have those conversations with South Australian government, for example, or Western Australia, we can say this is a real issue for us, and we either use those connections to get on the radar of a different department, or we respond to a review of a planning process that speaks on behalf of breweries. So that issue, I guess, in summary, we're trying to deal from the ground level, helping brewers get through it when they're in it, when they're in the thick of it, but also at the top level in that long road, I guess, of trying to change the schemes that are in place, so that people implementing them either have an easier time to do it because they understand it, or that the regulations then actually provide for it and say, we're going to support this by doing X, X, and X.
I think it was Russell Steele from RSA Liquor Professionals on. He talked a lot about the licensing requirements that a brewery and an alcohol producer needs to have. And I'm pretty sure it was him that talked about that the planning laws, I guess, nationally in Australia are very outdated. That they need to be extremely modernized, because back in, I don't know, when Coopers was starting out and your CUBs, we're talking over 100 years ago, that the planning laws haven't really significantly changed for brewery operators. So small independent mum and dad breweries are being thrown in the same basket as what, a large production brewery like a CUB or, is doing tens of millions of litres a year. There's just no separation of difference between them. And it's like they have to go through the same planning approval process. And so, basically what you're saying is the IBA is looking at trying to tailor that so that it's more, there's a separation of difference between the size of the brewery or the operator.
The challenge, Chris, without getting into, again, mind-numbing detail, is the challenge is what the planning schemes, again, in any state call a definition. So, and the way that they provide land. So a council has a job of working with the state government to provide land for housing. They need to provide a land supply of 15 years for housing. They need supply, and alongside the potential population, they need to supply a certain amount of land for commercial, so for jobs. But that's done in a segmented way. So, for example, your shop, like your local retailer, is in quite often called a commercial zone or a business zone. But your industry, where you manufacture things, needs, the perception is it's got to be out in an industrial area because you can have smelly uses and things like that. Then you have the definition on top of that of hospitality and what a pub is, or a hotel is a better term than the one that's quite often used. The challenge for us is that, in the vast majority of the time, it's a mix. Yeah. So you'll have the manufacturing happening on site. You'll have a tap room, which is hospitality. You'll have trucks coming in and out, which is a big thing if you're in a residential area. There are so many things that they need to consider, because a brewery that has a hospitality function quite often doesn't fit one particular definition. So the town planner, unless they're experienced, will find that very challenging to try and respond to all the conditions under that zone in the planning scheme. And so it would be impossible for us to be able to provide guidelines or some sort of tips on how to navigate, because all the systems are different. However, my aim is eventually get to something that is helpful, particularly with this is what you need to do before you lodge the application, because if you don't, it can get caught up for months and sometimes years. You can have to fight in VCAT. So it's, the resource that we provide will be, this is what you've got to get together. These are things that you'll be asked. These are things that you'll need to consider. And if you do that before you make the application, it will save you money. But if you had a brewery that was in an industrial estate, manufacturing beer, they wouldn't have a problem. The second you want to put a tap room out there, that's the problem, because that's not the definition of what industry is set up for, as general public to come in and out. And therefore traffic management, parking, all of these things need to be different. So it pushes that traditional, and as I said, these systems are quite often antiquated. There's only requirements generally in this state, they only have to update them every 10 years. And even then, they can get away with not updating them for another 5 after that. So it rarely keeps up with what consumers or the real world is doing. And changing it requires legislation, 2 houses of parliament. It's a big thing.
Yeah.
So working out initially how you fit and and if you've got people listening that are considering a brewery and they don't yet have a site, or even if they do have a site, this is a really big thing that needs to come into play, is to get their business model or their business plan locked in for the next 10 or 15 years. Because if you go into a council and say, this is what I want to do now, they'll only assess it on what you want to do now. And you could get into, if your grand plan is grander than what you're applying for at that time, you could set yourself up to fail, because you could get to the next stage and not actually allowed based on the site that you've chosen, yet you've invested a truckload of money into it. So, and there's some sad stories. Dollar Bill is a recent example of them going through a planning process in Ballarat. They're out in a rural area, they're surrounded by hobby farms, and they wanted to increase the hours of their cellar door, their tap room, sorry. Planning scheme gives it a definition of a cellar door because they don't have one of a tap room. And it was refused because a few people living around there didn't want loud music and all the things that they perceived would happen if a pub set up in a rural area, not just, a brewery manufacturing beer in a beautiful facility that just wanted to have a few extra hours a year where people could come and enjoy the beer. They now are forced with having to potentially move after having made a significant investment into that space. So if I can sort of give any advice whatsoever, it's just make sure you've got your plan as to what your long-term plan for your brewery in place first, so then you can find a site that's more applicable. Or if you've got a site, you need to understand all the ways in which it can be used before you move ahead. And to your listeners, that's a resource that I'm happy to give that advice and some of those tips and tricks in lieu of having anything in place yet.
Yeah, well, it has been a hot topic on the podcast so far, and that daunting process of going through council to open up a brewery. But probably a statement that stirred a lot of interest and excitement was my episode with Ben Tesorio from CPS Planning, who's been involved in a lot of the planning applications for a lot of the Inner West breweries. And he mentioned something very interesting on the podcast about, I think it's the New South Wales government, it's currently sitting with them, about the, legislation change for what a brewery is. It's classified as a food and artisan use or industry use, but they're not allowed to go through the CDC route into complying development code. So where they can go for a private certified and bypass the council DA process, and it can be extremely fast tracked, save a lot more money, allow them to open up even sooner. Is that something on your radar? Is that something that you know much about in terms of where that's sitting with New South Wales government? Because Ben did say, I think I interviewed him back in December last year, and he said that early this year we might start hearing some things. It's looking very favourable. I think they were trialling it with a couple of breweries. Mountain Culture were talked about as their production brewery opening up in Emu Plains as one. Are you able to talk or comment about any of that?
Yeah, I'm obviously not an expert in the detail of every scheme and the issues within the scheme in each state. However, this is mentioned, the New South Wales Independent Action Plan the state government launched a plan to support our sector, and it has a wide range of recommendations. And, I use this as an example of a successful model of industry working with government, because we meet regularly, and we've got another working group meeting coming up next week, and every government department that has some responsibility or remit for implementing that plan meets with us and meets with industry, and everybody reports on what they've done. And, there's some amazing stuff. We're even doing trial barley crops through the agriculture department to determine whether or not they can have a New South Wales branded barley. The resources that they're committed and the commitment that they have generally is extensive. And it's going really well. And one of the actions that is currently on the agenda, and that was on the agenda last year, things got a little bit out of whack last year, Chris, just in regard to, because it was a different kind of year that we all had, and all of a sudden, we got a grant from the New South Wales government just to help New South Wales brewers and to help some of our activities. So we kind of went, okay, this is what we were doing, now we need to do this. So the planning stuff may have come up a little earlier if we hadn't had the 2020 that we did. But it's definitely on the radar. The New South Wales Department of Planning sits around that working group. All of the executives that are responsible for the implementation plan of that plan have it in their own KPIs. And so, which is why I use it as a really great model for what other states could be doing. And planning is definitely on the radar. So I don't have an update on that specific process, but the meeting's next week. So as soon as we know, there's a bit happening in New South Wales with regs at the minute, wastewater and a few other liquor licensing issues. So we communicate with our members by state as well. And so we'll have an update for our state members on all of those regulatory issues after our working group meeting next week. I know that that's not particularly helpful for this podcast. However, I will make sure I update you, and you can maybe bang it out in your Facebook group or something like that.
Yeah, perfect. Like you said, you're representing an industry right across the country, so I can imagine that not everything is not one person.
I try.
No.
I try and keep up with it all.
you definitely sound very in tune with, I guess, the biggest issues that are facing the industry. And another topic that's come up a bit, and I know that Matt Kierkegaard and Pete Mitchell from Radio Brews News talk quite a bit about this, but tap contracts. There was an investigation done in recent years about the, I guess, anti-competitive nature of some of the bigger breweries when it comes to this quid pro quo type arrangement with publicans, pubs and clubs for getting their beers on tap. Are you able to share some thoughts around that?
Yeah, our organisation has done quite a lot of, and you'll find interviews even with me and in talking about tap contracts, and something again that I had to. You really need to understand it in its entirety to be able to argue against it or to understand how it impacts us. And it's, and this will always be on our radar as an opportunity that the little guys need access to. If you don't have your own hospitality venue, tap room, brew pub, restaurant, one of the things that you obviously need to do is to try and get your beer into either retailers or venues, and taps is a very good way to do that, and kegged product is obviously a very good way to do that. So the IBA have done quite a lot of work in this space and responded to the ruling that you mentioned was the ACCC in looking at tap contracts. They ruled that they were not anti-competitive. One of the challenges for us and for any independent brewer, any small business, which we absolutely are, even our largest breweries, is still challenged to compete in this space, is that the larger businesses like Lion and like CUB and their parent companies, Asahi and Kirin, are able to give venues long-term contracts that are heavily incentivised, but that comes with a certain percentage of or a certain ownership over taps. And it means that if a pub has 10 taps and they say, here's your 5-year contract, this is what we'll give you outdoor seating, we'll give you branded this, we'll give you this much, again, incentives attached to those contracts. Those contracts can say, we want 8 of your 10 taps. We want 9 of your 10 taps. And so what that means is that everybody else is competing for that one tap that's left. or that, however many taps that are not contracted. And those are long-term contracts. And obviously, I told you earlier, I ran a pub. Those are very sexy, those long-term contracts, because running a pub's not easy. It's certainly not a money-making exercise. You don't do it if you want to get rich. So, it's very attractive, certainly to a venue that is just has a pub. They just want to run a pub. They want to talk to people over the bar. They want to serve a meal. They don't really, they don't have to, and they don't necessarily care about what's on the taps. So those contracts are very attractive. But it means, as I said, they can write in conditions that limit the amount of taps. And that was the investigation that was done fundamentally by the ACCC. But they ruled them non-competitive because there are taps available. An independent brewer, even a medium-sized independent brewer is very challenged to be able to give those incentives over that long period of time. The finances just aren't there, or the production side, just isn't there to be able to ensure the amount of beer you need to guarantee that access to that tap. However, those things are changing. You see Stone and Wood on tap. I went out myself we had a public holiday here Monday, went to a little bar in Richmond, had 3 independents on taps. So the fact that we're getting access to taps is positive. The fact that we don't have access to as many taps as we would like is not positive, and we will continue to advocate for that wherever we can. But the reason that I explained to you earlier that our efforts are going into consumer awareness and raising and marketing directly to the people that are purchasing beer is because if they are demanding it in venues, it deals with the tap contract issue anyway. So if you've got people going in and saying, actually, I want something other than what those things are on tap, then publicans and venue managers and owners will start to go, okay, we need to supply this in some way because consumers are asking for it. And that's where we're moving to in terms of beer consumption is more boutique, different styles. There'll always be a home for a pot of draft. There'll always be a home for VB, sadly. But we're trying to tackle it in another way, if that makes sense. We're trying to come at it from consumer demand as well as advocating directly where the opportunity exists. The ACCC rulings are tough to try and overturn. So you need to wait for other milestones to come along that might be similar to your issue and then have them raise it again, or you need bucket load of money and a huge legal team behind you. So we've decided that we think we can try and deliver benefit to breweries in a different way than spending a huge amount of time on something that might be a massive brick wall. And as I said, going directly to the consumer is the way to do that.
We've also talked a bit about quality on this show, had Dan McCulloch and Richard Chamberlain come on from Lolomon Brewing. There's been this growing trend of there is a rise in craft, a lot of new breweries opening up. Like you mentioned the stat there, 6 breweries. A brewery opening up.
One every 6 days.
6 days. And with that, I guess you're seeing a lot of backyard homebrewers that just think it's great to open up a brewery. And I'll probably say I'm one of those as well. But I'm the reason I'm doing this podcast is to find out how to do it properly. But with that being said, a lot of new breweries opening up, inexperienced brewers, and that have now become commercial brewers. They've got an accountability and a duty of care with their product and who they, what sort of product they put out. So with that, there surely would come some quality issues. Can you talk a bit about how the IBA is sort of tackling that?
Absolutely. We just had a conversation about this morning as a result of an article in Brews News regarding ABV labelling. And so we have the project groups that I mentioned earlier, one of the quality project group we have in place to deal with exactly this. And as you've mentioned, with any industry that's growing rapidly, there's going to be some issues in this space. You've also, unlike maybe some others, you've got I was brewing a few bottles in my shed. Now this looks like a great business opportunity and, let's go. So it's one of the reasons we have a lot of resources in this space. The quality group is extremely active. We respond to issues before they happen. So we were already working on some stuff about ABV ratings, and packaging is a big thing just generally. So we've got a webinar coming up in April, a virtual mashup on packaging generally. There's members of that project group that are extremely experienced in this space. They have either worked at some of the retailers, so they know exactly what their QA teams want. Coles in particular have a very rigorous QA process, and so there's multiple checks and balances you need to go to if you're wanting to get into retailers, which is a really good thing. So we're now working with those trade or those QA components of the major retailers to ensure that what they need, we're telling our members so they can get it done before they get even into the queue to get into BWS or whatever whatever your preferred retailer might be. And internally on our members portal, there's quite a lot of resources in regard to QA or quality in general. So that's one of the benefits that we sell as the benefit of joining. Even if you're a brewery in planning, it costs you $500 a year to join our organisation as a brewery in planning to access all of those resources. And stuff like your series is brilliant because it then tells people that this is going to be an issue at some point, and hopefully the people that are smart business-minded people as well will realise that they need to do a whole lot more. There'll always be people that pay no attention to industry standards or resources, and then they get themselves in trouble. Design is a really important thing as well, which is why we do so much on packaging, and sometimes where people get in trouble, and that's why ABAC exists, the regulatory body that says you can't put that on a can or you can't put that on a sign. So, the regulatory environment that we participate in or we need to work through is extensive. However, there's always a resource in place to help you get through it, and if there's not, it'll be on our radar and we'll be building it at some point.
Perfect. Well, I know that this episode has been predominantly industry-related sort of topics, and I know we've covered quite a lot. There was a few other things I wanted to, but I think we would just go for an extra few hours otherwise.
We can always do a follow-up, Chris.
Yeah, exactly. But always get, I guess, industry insights, and I guess the position you're sitting in as the GM of the IBA, I guess you're somewhat in a position that might appear biased if you're saying that it's extremely optimistic craft beer in Australia. I guess you have to be optimistic in your role being the industry body. But talk to us about, I guess, some of the interesting trends or insights you're seeing within the craft beer space in Australia.
I really have tried not to mention COVID too many times because I'm a bit sick of it, and I imagine everybody else is. But last year was really tough, and it had an impact. And in some states where lockdown measures or restrictions either are still in place or were tougher than others, we still got breweries that are a bit challenged. People still haven't been able to go back to either full capacity or full staff because they've had to lay people off. So we are coming out of it well, and there's some states that are, doing really well. Interstate travel, intrastate or within the state travel in Western Australia was brilliant. So they're well supported. So really, I think, as I mentioned earlier, the support that we got from consumers last year and through the retailers was amazing. It absolutely helped some breweries survive, and some of our members have told us that. So the trend, and the good thing about, and this is why I mention it in relation to trends, is the fantastic thing about that is that a lot of the retailers haven't dropped that extra stock because it's being sold, and it's being sold via fridges that say craft. And our point of sale and the seal is still being displayed, and we're working with all of the major retailers on cooperative campaigns moving forward. So, and they don't do that if the trend isn't there. They're ruthless. They will not do that if they're not seeing a profit in that space. And so for us, that's a really good thing. And in a non-COVID world, it may have taken us years to get some of those benefits. So that is a good thing that came out of it, and we will continue to work that as hard and as best we can. But the trend, and you see a lot of information at the minute about drinking generally in this country, and the trends as to how people are going, awareness of health benefits or disbenefits, or however you might want to describe it. And so we're seeing, I think, an opportunity for us, even though we're being told by the research that alcohol consumption is going down. The fact that other studies are saying the sales of craft beer in the last year or independent beer went up is a really good thing. But I think, again, that's about what people are wanting. The trend over the years in people wanting to understand where their food comes from, the popularity of organics and biodynamic food, and experiences at wineries of going and making your wine and knowing what's going into it, knowing people want to be told what their beef has been fed because they want to know what's going into their body. And I think the experiences and the tourism experiences even and those that you can now purchase have gone through the roof. And so we stand, I think, really well placed to benefit from that because of that artisan nature I talked about. We are telling people that we're punching above our weight in terms of the ingredients that we're putting in beer, where, the breweries are taking advantage of this organic trend and saying, we used to put berries, now we're putting organic berries in. We've got an increase in breweries releasing gluten-free beer or non-alcoholic beer. We can even look at the trends in that, though I think we need to watch that space for a little bit more. But again, I think we're really well placed because the people that are drinking beer that is made by our members or by our industry are connoisseurs, and they're the ones that want to try something different. They're the ones that are not necessarily buying beer based on price point, and they're willing to explore new things, which is why some of those beers we were talking about earlier and seltzers and other bits and pieces are coming out, is because it's responding to what consumers want. So I feel positive. I'm paid to be positive, Chris. However, I feel really positive about where the industry is going, but I feel even more positive about the relationship we can have and the role that we can play. And I close my eyes and look at where we are at those 2025 targets, and it's not too far away, scarily. 2025 used to seem like a long way away, but it's not. And I think if you look at the trends over the last 5 years, if they continue, we will absolutely hit our targets, and our footprint in the national beer space will be well recognised. And I think that only stands to benefit everybody in our sector, including our associate members, which are those that supply the beer sector. I was talking to Cryomol not long ago, and David was saying to me, we better, if we're one of the major suppliers to the industry, if you're going to meet those targets, we need to know that because we've got to meet those targets as well. And so then their business development plans change. So the exciting thing for me is that this industry works together like no other. I've never seen one that is so collaborative. And as you mentioned earlier, they're willing to share information with you about how to start a brewery, even though that's essentially commercially confident information, to benefit the growth of the whole beer community. So I think good time to be in and great time to be having fun.
Yeah, no, it definitely seems like there's a growing momentum behind it all in the craft beer space, and a lot of people have come on and said that it's a great time to get involved. There's a lot more room for new entrants, even though it is becoming a very competitive market space, especially on the bottle shop shelves.
Yeah.
But there's so much more regional opportunity as well, and suburban opportunities. I know that the inner west is very saturated now. Doesn't mean you can't open a brewery in that area, but there's been a lot of regular talk about, if they were to start again, they'd open up a brew pub in regional Australia because, you can just become that little hyper local pub that everyone knows and making great beer. So yeah, and it's really interesting to see where it's going to go. But
I agree with you. I think 2/3 of our members, or 2/3 of breweries, sit in regional areas. That's a large percentage, and travel within this country is only going to be more important. Who knows how long our borders won't be open, who knows what restrictions they'll have on international travel. So, and providing jobs in regional areas is really important, as well as meeting places. So I think, as you've said, looking at opportunities in regional areas, if I was opening a brewery, I would.
Yeah. Well, coming towards the end of our chat, Kylie, any closing thoughts and advice you'd like to part ways with for any breweries or any people thinking about opening a brewery or breweries in planning?
As I said earlier, Chris, we've got a huge amount of resources. I talk to people that are not our members all the time. I had a great conversation with a guy last week that had a pub and he just wanted to know what he needed to do to put a brewery in there, and he'll join eventually. So I guess the point there is that I welcome any conversation just to know what's happening, who's out there. $500 a year to join as a brewery in planning, not a huge amount of, maybe a couple of coffees a week or something. If you have a look at what that can probably deliver you in terms of benefit. BrewCon, I mentioned earlier, we're building the conference program at the minute, but because we didn't have a conference last year, going to be bigger and better, and there'll be lots of things to learn, but also some good fun to be had. I haven't experienced one yet, sadly, but I'm told that it's it's a big couple of days in terms of learning, but also networking and just catching up. People learn a lot, but also meet lots of good new mates. The Indies Awards will be opening for entries in the next couple of months, so have a look out for that for the breweries that are already, underway. Come along to BrewCon, have a look at our events, sign up to our database so you get our newsletters so you know of when those state-based mashups are. And just talk to us. We're a small, very, very small team at the minute, but we're an easygoing bunch of people and we're always willing to help. And as I mentioned before, this, delightfully, this industry is so cohesive and willing to share that it's a really good one to be in if you're humming and hawing about whether or not to do it.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Well, I have to, if I can sort of make you blush right now, that IBA are doing an absolute fantastic job. I know I don't have a brewery and I'm not in the commercial space, but just meeting so many people in the industry that they say nothing but good things about what you guys are doing.
Thanks.
And what a perfect time to have an industry body like you guys to sort of help with this growing momentum that we're seeing. So hopefully this series, the IBA and all the collaborative efforts across the industry will see an even bigger growth in the industry. So, but thanks again for coming on, Kylie. I really do appreciate it. And once again, everyone, that was Kylie Lethbridge, General Manager of the Independent Brewers Association.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks for listening to the Build Me a Brewery podcast. I hope you all enjoyed the final guest featured episode of Series 1. As mentioned in the introduction of today's episode, make sure you have a listen to my short conclusion episode on the series, which nicely sums up the original series of the podcast, as well as my biggest learnings to date, where I'm at in my brewery building plans, and I also share with you all the future direction of the podcast, so make sure you have a listen. As always, if you are liking the podcast so far and find the content useful, please give us a follow and rating on whatever platform you're listening on. Also, follow us on all our social media handles, as well as visiting our website, www.buildmeabrewery.com.au. I will also mention to listeners that we now have a new Build Me a Brewery discussion group linked to our Facebook page. This is a group of keen listeners and like-minded people discussing their brewery build plans and providing advice to others on the subject. Link to this group will be in the episode show notes. That's all for now. I'm Chris Hayton, your host, and this is the Build Me a Brewery podcast.